Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Dean. I am the director of the Climate and Sustainability Practice at USC Dornsife Public Exchange. And I am thrilled to be joined today for a panel on the human condition. And throughout the course of the day, we've actually sort of been previewing this panel, I think. We've heard calls about behavior change. We've heard discussions about eco-anxiety. We even heard some, I think, of our psychologists' favorite terms, like nudges, and how we can help sort of mobilize the solutions that will be needed to combat the climate crisis. And so I am very pleased for this all-USC panel. Joining me on my left is Wendy Bruin de Bruin, who is a provost professor of public policy, psychology, and behavioral science at USC. She received her PhD in behavioral decision research and psychology from Carnegie Mellon University. She's a fellow of the British Academy of Social Sciences and the Society for Risk Analysis and the Psychonomic Society. She served on the National Academies of Sciences Committee on the Science of Science Communication, what Sue was just talking about, and her research focuses on public perceptions of climate change and designing communications to inform those perceptions. How apt. Next to Wendy is Joe Arvai, who is the Dana and David Dornsife Chair of the Wrigley Institute. He's the director and professor of psychology, biological sciences, and environmental studies. He received his PhD in behavioral decision research and environmental science from the University of British Columbia. He conducts research on how people make judgments and decisions and how they ultimately behave against the backdrop of environmental issues like climate change. He is a fellow of the Society for Risk Analysis and a science advisor to EPA Administrator Michael Regan. Thanks, Joe. And next to Joe, rounding out our panel for the day, is Gail Sinatra, who is the Stephen Crocker Chair and Professor of Psychology and Education and Associate Dean for Research at the Rossier School of Education at USC. She received her BS, MS, and PhD in psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's a fellow of both APA and American Education Research Association and a member of the National Academy of Education. She is the co-author of a book called Science Denial: Why It Happens and What to Do About It, published by Oxford Press in 2021. And so please join me in welcoming our panelists. So I think I'll actually start with you, Gail, going back sort of to even the beginning of today with Ho-Sung Lee from the IPCC. But climate science has sort of been at the heart of climate change since the get-go, when it was originally discovered. And conversations around climate science have come and gone in terms of trust and distrust of information. And so I'd be curious to maybe start with, we're seeing sort of historically unprecedented levels of distrust in science, both in climate science, but other forms of science, as we saw in the pandemic as well. So maybe you could speak a little bit to where we're at now in terms of science denial and what that means for climate action.
Sure, thanks for the question. It's really hard to say historically, are we at the highest level of science doubt, denial, and resistance, because we talk about all three in our book. It's hard to do that because there's not really good evidence to sort of quantify that over time. But I can say that it's being amplified. And certainly it's being amplified through social media. So we see that. And I think the other important point is that the amount of mis and disinformation that is being pushed out to people has been amplified incredibly so. So I think we are seeing increased levels of distrust and mistrust because that's been amplified and because it's being pushed by people with particular maybe political agendas or economic agendas and bad actors in general. So in that way, I do think it's become a little bit more severe at this time.
And are there certain forces that have been leading to this? What is sort of causing this increase in science distrust and disinformation?
Well, I think it's really been pushed, right? So it's not that people just fall into these rabbit holes of mis and disinformation and science mistrust or distrust. It's that they're pulled down into these rabbit holes. So if you can think about how social media and some of the platforms work, everybody knows about the algorithms and what those algorithms do, right? So people are sort of pulled into a certain sphere, and then those sort of negative messages get amplified. People are much more likely to read and find out about scientific information that's shared on Facebook than anywhere else. And if your Facebook friends, is a group of climate scientists, you're probably getting good information. But if your Facebook friends, don't have up-to-date or correct information from the scientific standpoint, then they're just going to be reading about and amplifying mis and disinformation. And we're seeing with these platforms that have not been particularly responsive to controlling mis and disinformation, and some platforms that have gone into the business of making it part of their business model to amplify dis and misinformation, that people are in fact, really just in that stew. And so I think that's really what has exacerbated the problem of mistrust, because it's been fomented.
And Wendy, I know you've done a bit of research as well around trust of information in scientific sources. And so how are you seeing this play out?
Thank you for asking. I wanted to follow up on this because I always hear a lot of concern among climate scientists, climate activists, that, what about all these science deniers and people who think climate change isn't real, and how do we communicate better to them to convince them that they really should be concerned and do something about this? And while I think that is important, we should not overlook that at this point in time, it's actually a majority of people who is now concerned about climate change. So, and we're seeing that, and that didn't always used to be the case.
Definitely.
And so the public opinion overall has changed. Even though there is more misinformation, a majority is not being swayed by that misinformation. And a majority of people around the world, including in the United States, is now reporting on surveys that they are concerned about climate change and would support climate-friendly policies. And while we should worry about the misinformation, I think we should also worry about communicating with that majority, because that majority that is concerned doesn't necessarily know what to do about climate change, and also is feeling. So Joe and I supervised a PhD student who did a survey of Americans who are concerned about climate change but are not necessarily acting. And she asked them, why are they not acting? And one of the main reasons was they felt like their action wouldn't make a difference and nobody else is doing anything. And so we should also, the people who are already concerned, we should think about how to reach them well with our communications and not just spend all of our time worrying about the misinformation, although that is important as well.
Joe, would you like to add further to this? I think in particular how, again, to Wendy's point, if the goal is to focus on those who are concerned, are there specific things that we should be focusing on with them or how to reach them?
I'm going to do the classic politician thing and
Please.
just answer a question that I'm not even sure if it's the right question. But I would agree with both Wendy and Gail, as I often do. We did an empirical study of downstream effects of misinformation about climate change. Exposing people on purpose to misinformation about climate change, and then seeing how that manifested through time. And we don't see a large effect of that misinformation sticking with people. But if you think about the scale at which X and Facebook and these other platforms operate, even a small number of people who are getting bamboozled by, or a small percentage of people getting bamboozled, is still this vastly huge number of people. So you've got to sort of throttle between, how are we going to measure effect? Is it going to be based on numbers of people or, percentages of people who get hit? So there's certainly that element. Wendy's absolutely right. The student, by the way, is this wonderful PhD student in psychology named Yamakanta, who studied exactly this idea of, why don't people who actually care about climate change actually do much about it? And it's because people, I think, ultimately feel quite isolated in terms of what they can actually do to make a difference. And then I would sort of editorialize a little bit on both of those points. One of the issues that goes through my mind a lot is, as it relates to universities, we used to say when it came to science that, we don't teach students or even in climate communication, we don't teach people like what to think, or we don't tell them what to think. We just kind of tell them how to think. And more these days, I think we need to emphasize that it's okay to think. Like it's actually okay to form your own opinions, and they don't have to be the same as mine or yours, but at least go to the trouble of doing a little bit of thinking about stuff. So that to me is kind of one of the crucial things that underlies a lot of these conversations about behavior. Just getting people to first think and then try and connect those judgments to some behaviors.
Well, and I might ask Gail, is that one of the ways in which we can combat science denial? Like, is that, asking for more critical thinking skills a useful approach?
Well, first I want to say I absolutely agree with Wendy that the number of science deniers is really much smaller. And we talk about in our book, the bigger groups are the folks who are sort of resisting and doubting. Those are much, much bigger groups. But what I think happens in the social media platforms I was talking about is the hardcore deniers get amplified much more. So you have the impression, if you get on the platform formerly known as Twitter, that that it's like everybody in the whole country is a science denier, which of course is absolutely untrue, as Wendy pointed out. But those negative voices, get amplified. It's just like when you turn on the news and it's like, murder, tragic traffic accident, and these horrible things that you see, you feel like that's happening everywhere, every second. When there's a lot of positive things happening, it's the same thing. So the good news about the increase in climate awareness and acceptance is not amplified to the extent that the bad news is. So you're asking about what we can do about it. Well, we've been talking all day about these fantastic scientific, technological, engineering, and economic success stories about what we can do to address the climate crisis. But what you've heard also all day is it's really all about the people. It's all about individuals and groups of individuals making better decisions, getting access to better information, making different choices. So what we really need is we need much more research of the kind that Joe and Wendy do to advance our understanding of how to better inform and persuade individuals to accept science and to make changes in their own behaviors that actually will make a difference in their lives in a positive way and will help the environment.
Perfect segue. So I think, Wendy, I know that you were particularly inspired by some of the conversations going on around transportation and our own individual decisions and how we can choose to help, I guess, support the transition in our own way, right? Mobility choices come down to individual action and which transport sector do you want to see change, right? And so I'd be curious, I guess, for your thoughts on how behavioral change sort of can lead to these uptake and solutions. How are you seeing behavior change as a driver of adoption for climate solutions?
So, I was thinking when that conversation was happening about the findings of Yema Kante, who found that people who are concerned about climate change are not necessarily acting because they feel like nobody else is. Mm-hmm. And then to counteract that through interventions, it's important to actually show that other people are acting and that we are in this together and that it is possible to make those changes. And so when the conversation was going towards nobody in LA walks, takes the bus and bikes, we heard some voices of people saying, actually, it's possible to do that. And so I wanted to bring my bicycle helmet to show that, that it is, well, not to say that I'm such a wonderful person, because I'm not. I also do things that are not great. But it's the communications that focus on the good examples tend to be effective because it makes other people realize that it is possible to bike to USC. I realize not for everyone, but I am happy to do it, and so I wanted to highlight this so that we don't leave this conference thinking that in LA it's just not possible to make this change. There are people in LA who are living without a car, and and some of them are in this room.
Thank you. Yeah, as a fellow Metro rider myself, I completely agree. And there's a lovely stop right at the edge of campus. Joe, you've spent a lot of time actually thinking about this question, which is how do you motivate behavior change in individuals? And I guess I would ask for maybe an example of some of the more successful cases that you've seen, especially I think around utilization of even carbon in different products, and how are we getting basically consumers on board with climate solutions?
Yeah, I think there are so many things that we can and should be doing, and I'm gonna kind of shift the spotlight away from the consumer to the policymaker, maybe to start. And I'm looking across at Detloff over there as I say this stuff. I mean, I think the one thing that we all have to realize, and I think we do realize, but it's easy to forget in a room like this, is that climate change isn't happening in a vacuum. There are things happening all around the world that do and don't have anything to do with climate change. And we can trumpet how great it is that billions of dollars are in the IRA, but those billions of dollars aren't now going to other programs that matter to people that may or may not be loosely connected, or may not be connected to climate change at all. So getting people to think about climate change as part of a much larger system, and the fact that we need to start making priorities across a broad range of social considerations and environmental considerations, and then deploying our resources in a way that is aligned with those priorities. It's sort of the realm of decision analysis. It's not something that's groovy or cool. No one's getting a Nobel for decision analysis, although I guess Herbert Simon sort of did, like 70 years ago. But it's sort of like the grunt work, the heavy lifting of decision making, and I frankly feel like not enough of that is happening. Period. And it's not happening in companies. If you think about companies and their budgets for their C-suites, their chief marketing officer is making $1 million, their chief economist is making a couple of $1 million, their chief strategist is making a couple of $1 million. There's no chief decision support officer in the room. There's just this assumption that get a bunch of rich, smart guys in a room, and I emphasize guys, and magic will happen. Well, you're seeing the magic kind of unfolding before your eyes. It's not that magical. So there's that, and then when it comes to us as consumers, we love to blame people. We really do, and I even detected that in some of the Q&A in the room. Not that I'm upset about it, but if we do something that's great, it's because of some dispositional characteristic that's just awesome about us. We work hard, we're smart, or whatever. But if some other person is falling down, it's because they're a jerk. So they don't care. They don't. And I think we sort of create these barriers that aren't helpful. So even if you're trying to nudge people toward making the right thing, you've got to overcome this fact that the vast majority of the people you're trying to nudge, because you're lecturing them and they don't want to be lectured at. So, again, I'm not sort of directly answering the question, but I think we need to take a step back and look much more closely and deeply at who we are as human beings and as organizations before we leap to what the next sort of behavioral solution is going to be, because that, in my view, is just going to alienate a lot of folks.
Well, I guess that...
Or I guess.
I mean, I think that's sort of a theme we've heard throughout the day as well, right? Which is the need for large-scale transformational change. And where does that start, and what is our role in it as individuals versus what is the obligation of policymakers or other decision makers? And I think the other piece of this that we've heard throughout the day is that individuals feel disempowered. They don't know what to do because they feel that either decision makers aren't reflecting their views, they feel that they're alone in taking action, or they're completely overwhelmed with, climate grief. And so I think the question for all of you, as especially psychologists, is how do we confront that as individuals? Where can we help individuals who are facing this challenge find useful ways of engaging if they are not seated in the halls of power?
Well, I think one of the problems is we've, politicized, of course, climate and climate action, just the way we politicize the pandemic. The coronavirus really didn't care if you were a Democrat or a Republican. You had equal chance of getting it as far as the coronavirus was concerned. So but we politicized it, so therefore we politicized actions. And so then some people were more likely to get it or not get it based on their actions. And so I think that's what's happening, of course, with climate change, is that people are politicizing choices, like you're a good person if you ride an e-bike, and you're a bad person if you drive to work. And really what we need to do instead is give people good information, give them access to opportunities, for example, the transportation session we just had, to get to work conveniently and easily in a lower carbon solution. There are people who want to make these choices, but they don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it, and the choices are not made easy for them to do. And their sort of identity group maybe is pushing back on it. So that's one thing that we work on in our research, is shifting that identity group. So using we language to emphasize, like, we Trojans, we care about the climate, we care about how we're going to get to USC. So if you use we language and emphasize identities that we share rather than identities that we may not share, that's one way you can do a little better job of communicating.
Right, and that way people don't feel like they're doing it alone, but they're doing it together.
And I would say if we could at this meeting just agree as a group that we're not going to talk about a war on climate change or a fight about climate change. The minute we start invoking war language and fight language, it does exactly what Wendy and Gail are talking about. It creates this us versus them mentality. It's very much something that we're in together. I would add, and because you're in education, I think this is absolutely crucial. If you think about how we've progressed, especially through the social media era, the norms around kind of evidence handling, norms around how we interface with information, norms around, to whom do we outsource decision-making or comprehension when we ourselves don't understand a whole lot about a particular topic. That all sort of is built on this foundation of critical thinking. And I think to start reinstilling those norms, as I said at the very beginning, that not just that we don't want to tell you what to think, but we want to tell you it's okay to think. Reinstilling those norms, across the board, but in particular at an early age, that people can form their own opinions. They don't have to go with the herd. They don't have to go with their political affiliation. I mean, it's preposterous in this country that we wear our liberal versus conservative badge and basically have to toe the line, regardless of whether or not those outcomes really align with our values. It's frankly, it's absurd, but it's driven by this fact that these norms around evidence handling have been replaced by these norms around allegiance, blind allegiance to these worldviews that are leading us astray.
I think it's interesting because that conversation is certainly taking place, especially within the US, but how that conversation advances in other countries where there's more limited access to information is a sort of whole other challenge. And I know, Wendy, you're working a lot on this with the Lloyd risk poll and related to how people are getting their information and based off of that information, whether or not they're thinking critically about it and perceiving risk to their daily lives. And so I'd be curious to learn a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. So the Lloyd's Register Foundation World Risk Poll is a worldwide survey that has drawn nationally representative samples in 142 countries around the world. It's very unique because most survey research is done in high-income countries, United States, Europe, but this is around the world, including Global South. And they ask people about their concerns about climate change and their concerns about severe weather. So one finding is that when I said before the majority of the people around the world are concerned about climate change, that's a finding from that poll. But if you look at, for example, differences around the world, you do see that in Africa, concerns about climate change are the lowest. And I found that surprising because Africa is one of the places in the world where climate impacts are hitting the hardest and expected to be the worst. And but then when we looked at people's concerns about severe weather, those were actually the highest in Africa. And then I spoke to people who were from various African countries and said that they had family members who didn't know the word for climate change. And of course, it's very hard to be concerned about something that you don't know the word for. And then we were also seeing that education around the world, actually in every single country, your level of education predicts your likelihood of being concerned about climate change. So people with a college education tend to be more likely to say that they're concerned about climate change. You don't need a college education to recognize that the weather is becoming worse. That is unrelated to education at all. So what I take away from that is that if we want to communicate about climate change to people around the world, internationally, we need to make sure that climate change is a concept that is easier for them to understand, and so that you don't need a college degree to understand it. And perhaps we should refer to the extreme weather events that people will be experiencing locally or are already experiencing locally so that it makes it concrete for them. Related to that, so climate change itself is already a complicated construct, right? But what we're also seeing is that a lot of climate change communications are actually quite complicated, and they talk about climate change in very complicated language. IPCC reports, for example, tend to be written at university level language and use a lot of climate change terminology that is not necessarily well known to people who don't have a PhD in climate change. And you're nodding because you were part of that study. So Monica and Lance and I actually were part of a team that asked IPCC authors to identify key terminology that they think is central for understanding the concept of climate change and everything surrounding it. And it included words that we've heard today, including mitigation, adaptation, carbon neutral, sustainable development, and so on. And then we interviewed people from around the United States who were concerned about climate change or not concerned about climate change. And we asked them how easy they found those terms, and we asked them to define those terms. And I'll give you two examples of what was going on. Generally, we found that people felt like those climate change communications were going over their heads. They felt that mitigation was the hardest term amongst the terms that we tested, so they thought it was not easy to understand what mitigation meant. When we asked them to define it, they often confused it with mediation or resolving a conflict. So they basically were drawing on their knowledge of everyday language to try to figure out what it might mean in the context of climate change, and they struggled with that. And then adaptation, which is also a very common word in climate change communications, which we've also heard used today several times. When we asked people to define adaptation, they said, oh, that is actually an easy word. I know what that means. It means turning a book into a movie. And that's what it means in everyday language, but it's not what it means when climate scientists or climate communications use it. And so then we also asked people, those who did recognize the words, to give us definitions that might be easier for people to understand. And they said, well, instead of mitigation, why not say something like actions we can take to fight climate change, or don't fight.
No fighting.
Not fight. Actions we can take to
reduce
is a little
pollution.
Help.
Yes, and
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah.
Good. Well done.
Result.
And for adaptation, they said actions we can take to protect ourselves from the climate change that is already happening. So if you use everyday language, then climate change communication might be easier for people to understand, and even if they don't have a university degree.
Well, and I think there's really severe potential impacts of this, right? If you use language that people don't understand, then this gets directly into another line of research I know all three of you have worked on, which is around risk, right? If people don't understand what's happening because of climate change, do they understand the risk that that's posing to them? Mm-hmm. And I would be curious for any of you, actually, feel free to jump in, to I guess, provide some suggestions for how we, particularly in the science community and at this university, can help in addressing that.
Well, Wendy's the risk expert, so she should probably start.
If you want a quick list of suggestions to communicate well about risk, use everyday language. As a rule of thumb, avoid words that are 3 syllables or more, because those tend to be less common in everyday language and more likely to be jargon. Focus on, make it personal and concrete so that you can explain to people what it means to them. And give them, don't just scare them, but also, or try to avoid scaring them, but instead try to empower them, give them things that they actually can do about it so that they don't have to worry about the risk.
Yeah, I would fully agree. I mean, I think even if we kind of polled people in this room right now to define risk, I think a lot of us really wouldn't fully understand what risk is from the perspective of people who are doing risk analysis for a living. It's the function of the probability of something bad happening and the consequences of whatever that bad thing is. So you can take something like a nuclear disaster, very high consequence, very low probability, therefore very low risk. But people don't think of risk like that. They think of nuclear disaster as, a nuclear holocaust. It's terrible. It's very high risk, even though the odds of it happening are very low. You can look at other things that are, not very high consequence, but highly probable. And as a result of that, the risk ends up being, in some cases elevated. So things that seem very mundane, in fact, end up being, very risky. Like, most people, drown in, a few inches of water, not in the ocean. Why? Because there are higher, the odds of doing something wrong in 3 inches of water, your tub, are much higher than swimming in the ocean, which people, rarely do. So you've got to start thinking about risk in terms of, what it actually means. Most people think of it as just they don't even think about it, they feel it. It's a feeling you have. Something is bad or something is good. Something is kind of dreadful and uncertain or something isn't. And that's how risk gets defined. So, we did a study a few years ago that sort of tried to get at this. The paper was called something like, people don't just disagree with each other, they disagree with themselves. And we asked people to think about things that were risky and to then think about a range of actions that they could deploy to alleviate those risks. One of them was climate change. And we asked people just to think holistically about what was going on and what they would like to see done. Then we asked people in the same study to start thinking about their priorities in relation to that risk. What kinds of elements of that risk were most consequential, not just as a feeling, but as something that was empirical. And then we asked them to provide some information about their priorities. And then from those priorities, we could use some fancy economic tools to start making predictions about what of the actions that were available to them would be the best at addressing their individual concerns. And to make a very long story short, people's ability to make a decision that was in line with their priorities when it came to managing risks was around 60%. That means, a coin flip does almost as good as you do when you are thinking about what to do in the face of risk. And that's because your feelings in response to those risks get in the way. Your feelings kind of overpower your ability to be empirical. That frightens the bejesus out of me, to think that coin flips can do a better job than we can as individuals. But I've seen this, in physicians, I've seen it in literal rocket scientists, I've seen it in policymakers. This is not an uncommon phenomenon. So going back to my earlier point about the need for capacity building so that individuals through education and organizations through legitimate organizational governance structures and capacity can actually overcome some of the psychological biases that lead us astray is so urgent, yet so underinvested in.
Well, people are terrible at judging risk, in part because of everything you just said, and also because it's based on probabilities, and one thing that we're really bad at is probabilistic reasoning. So we're definitely not great at judging risk. I also think that when you start talking about risks, some people communicate it in ways that is scary or conveys sort of the doomerism we talked about earlier. And that's really bad. People don't tend to act if they feel doomed, because why bother? So doomerism is something that I think we have to be careful when we communicate about risks to not fall into that kind of communication strategy. People don't really act sensibly or make great decisions when they feel threatened. and when they feel as though they have no hope. So those are not great strategies for communicating about climate.
Thank you. Well, I invite anyone who would like to ask a question to start coming and lining up. Ooh, wow, that was fast. And while we line up, I was just going to say, does the fact that is climate risk different than other types of risk? And I ask that because one of the long-standing questions that policymakers have faced is that climate change is sort of this long onset event versus other type of risks that are more immediate. Is that changing how people are perceiving this risk?
Can I jump in on this one? You were going to get ready to say, but I was excited. I was waiting for this question.
I can wait.
So think about if you're at the age where you're thinking about this thing. Think about your investment portfolio. Think about where you put your money for your retirement, or where your manager puts your money for retirement. What are they doing? They're making investments. They're evaluating performance. They're looking at risk. They're looking at return. They're making an investment. They're divesting. They're investing over here. Then they're divesting. They're very adaptive. Not adaptation as in making a move, but they're very adaptive with those resources. So the capacity, the institutional structures that help people to make the kinds of decisions that are very similar to climate risk management decisions, those structures are there. Look at the military. They have a lot of resources, as do governments, to deal with climate change. If the military builds a boat, and it costs $1 billion and the first boat doesn't do what they want to, they kill it instantly. They don't worry about the $1 billion that just got, quote unquote, wasted. They learn from an experience. Climate change is somehow different in that we're sort of all hand wavy, and we like to argue, and we like to kind of proselytize ourselves at the altar of different technologies, but we don't think about it as a resource allocation problem, whether we're individual consumers or whether we're organizations. And until we do, in my humble opinion, we are, in terms of actually being able to make the kind of progress we need to make to address the climate challenge. And then it'll be too late.
Well, it's also very unconcrete, right? It's an abstract concept. So what we can do as communicators is we can make it more concrete, right? So we shouldn't be talking about 30 years from now. And we shouldn't be talking about the uncertainty in climate models, because those things make it very confusing and very abstract. We should be talking about it as more concrete. I think the connection to severe weather would be an example where that is affecting us. Fires is affecting us in California. Drought is affecting us. The water, we talked about those things today. I think making it more concrete is helpful.
So in climate change used to be different from other risks in that it was perceived as something that was happening in the future, something that was uncertain, and something that would happen to others. And those are three features of risk that make people worry less about it. But public opinion is changing, and I think, like we said before, a majority of people is now concerned about climate change. And I think that is because their perceptions of climate change are changing. So it no longer feels like it's going to happen in the future. A lot of people are feeling it's happening now with the wildfires and crazy weather that we've been having. And that's true for many places around the world. And it no longer feels like, so it feels like it's happening now. It no longer feels like so uncertain because we're seeing it. And it no longer feels like it will happen just to others because we've seen it here. And so that climate change was different from other risks, but I don't think it still is, less so.
I would add to all of that, that's all true. So I don't dispute any of that. But when it comes to wildfire, people in the San Fernando Valley aren't going to posse up and go do defensible space around their homes. People in Santa Monica aren't going to go and form a collective and go do erosion control on the beach. What's going to happen is governments and institutions and organizations are going to have the discipline to make those kinds of decisions. So in as much as individual consumers or members of the public are more aware and more concerned, and we can do all these great things that actually communicate to them what the reality of the risk is, when the rubber hits the road, your elected leaders, your business CEOs, I could go on, they are letting you down. They are letting you down. They're emphasizing profits over the future. They're looking at short-termism. Can I get elected instead of looking at the long-term forecast? I'm sorry to just be. I said earlier that I should have worn a green suit and a trash can to this meeting, but this stuff just gets me. I get really pissed.
Well, I might just challenge you on that last bit, because as a former policymaker, we can only do, as you're saying, what is politically viable. And I don't want to disempower people, because if you are calling my office every day, if you are sending letters, if you are voting, and if you are telling me that as a policymaker, you want me to go do erosion control, you want me to go fund fire support, then I'm going to do it, right? I need you as the general public to give me the will as a policymaker to legislate in a way that you want to see.
I would disagree with that. If you look at where the funds from special interests come in that drive the intentions of the vast majority of policymakers, especially in this country, I frankly don't see that. I mean, we could argue that all you want, but I don't see that. I see the Koch brothers. I see the American Freedom Caucus. I see a lot of people out there with just a boatload of money who are setting agendas in ways that do not align with either a certain policymaker's preferences or certainly a lot of the public's preferences.
There's definitely special interests, and we're certainly not going to overcome all of those, but we can get to the questions in line. So I'm going to turn over to Mick.
Yes. Thanks. So Joe's answer to the previous question actually triggered this question in my mind. So it was perfect timing. But, Joe, you talked about, I'm going to slaughter this, but essentially we need to increase the capacity of people to analyze a risk so that it can overcome some of these psychological characteristics that cause us to do other things. So my question is, if it's 60-40, should we instead or in addition to actually cater to those psychological characteristics to get people to make the right decisions rather than or in addition to building their capacity to make a rational decision? Because, I mean, this is what marketers have done for over a century that has helped get us into the situation that we're in. Sold us a whole bunch of stuff we don't need, and get us to buy a car because of emotional feelings rather than rational feelings and things like that. So they've been very successful at it. Should we be doing that ourselves?
I bet you're going to have 3 or 4 divergent opinions on this stage. I'm not a big nudging guy, which is kind of what you're describing. I think that you can nudge a lot of individual behaviors in incremental directions that make a difference. So I'm not going to, we can get people to eat less meat, which is a big contributor to climate change. We can get people to, keep their lights off, which, reducing energy consumption. We can do all of that kind of stuff, and that's good. I'm not going to, get down on any of that. But you're not going to nudge an energy transition. You're not going to nudge, direct air capture of carbon dioxide. You're not going to nudge, big transportation, infrastructure plays that radically reshape the world around us. I mean, at least not at the pace that we would need to do it to be able to address the climate challenge over the very short time horizon we're dealing with. But that's one opinion.
I mean, in Germany, they were trying to switch people to green energy, and a lot of people weren't switching. And then they realized that because the consumers in Germany were given the option to switch to green energy, and they didn't. And then researchers tried to figure out why that was, and it was because a lot of people didn't really look at the mailings that they were getting from the electricity company. So then what they did is they did a nudge, and they switched to default, and they just sent people a mailing saying, we're switching you to green energy, but let us know if you don't want to. Mm-hmm. And so then suddenly the uptake of green energy was very high. So there is room for nudges.
That's true, but in this country, if you did that, there wouldn't be enough green capacity to actually address the challenge. So, and this is the same thing that happens with carbon credits. People are buying carbon credits left, right, and center, but what they don't realize is they're all buying the same carbon credit. This piece of land that's not going to be deforested is being sold 15, 16, 17 times over as the same carbon credit to different people thinking they're getting a unique credit. So again, we have to think, I agree with you, but we have to think about the system and what kind of capacity the system has. And I don't think you can nudge systems. You got to really get in there, roll up your sleeves, and do some heavy lifting instead of some nudging.
So I want to say that I want to sort of break down 2 dichotomies that we're talking about. This dichotomy of individual action versus, collective action at the system level. Do we need to do individual actions, and do they matter, or should we just, they don't matter? So it's all collective action. It's all systemic. It's like it all matters.
Right.
It all matters. It is a completely false dichotomy to suggest that we don't need individual actions, and it's a completely ridiculous statement to say we don't need systemic change, but they inform each other. You know, your neighbor puts solar panels on and you're like, hey, maybe I should put solar panels on. And before you know it, your whole block has solar panels. That can happen. We've seen that happen. But we also need people to call their congressperson and to push for better legislation. So I think the individual versus collective action thing is bupkis. The other thing that I wanted to say that Mick brought up is, and I want to really debunk this completely, the idea that it's either a rational decision or it's an emotional decision, and that people either think rationally or they think emotionally is complete nonsense. So Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, a very excellent psychologist here at USC, as well as many other people have shown, we think through and with our emotions. There is no such thing as a completely rational or completely emotional thought process. So what we have to do is think about how to leverage people's emotions to go the right direction towards what we want and to mitigate those negative emotions that prevent us from thinking carefully while we support the critical thinking, the decision making that we need them to do on the rational side.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Mick.
Thanks for asking.
We'll go to the other mic real quick.
It's a tough one to follow up. When we're talking about risk, obviously trust is a huge component of that. And I'm all for improving science communication. That's what I do. That's what I get paid to do. But I wonder what you all think about changing not just how we communicate science, but how we actually do science and how we involve broader audiences and how the process works.
I would be all in favor of that. I think that another, sort of dichotomy is there's people who know what's going on and people who don't know what's going on. And I think we've set up that situation where, as you know, as a science communicator, and we've discussed today many times, scientists aren't really trained to be great communicators to the public. That's why we need more science communicators to do that translation. But we could train scientists to be better communicators, and we can also involve more communities in research. And so that's something that we're working on individually. I have a project here where we're engaging communities in sustainability research. So that's really an important component, is it shouldn't be such a dichotomy. There's only people in the ivory towers doing research. That's crazy. We should be engaged with community members as we find out what questions they have and help them to answer those questions.
Either of you want to add?
I agree. Well, I mean, good science communication is a two-way mode of communication, and and even if you're developing a scientific report, finding out thinking about who your audience is and actually finding out from them what they need to know so that your report addresses what they want in language that they can understand is important. But you can also do science that way. And so instead of just coming up with questions that are theoretically motivated or interesting to scientists in an academic department, you could work with communities to find out what they want to know and help them get to those questions. And so the public exchange is doing that. So maybe Monica should tell us about that.
Yeah, so that actually is how I spend my days now at USC, which is the public exchange partners with external entities, be it public or private sector actors, who have a question. And we work with them to identify what that research question really is, what information they need from it, and what they're hoping to do with the information they get from it, most importantly. And then we built a research project around that. And so it's really knocking down the walls between academia and the world outside. That's our goal, is how can all of this expertise be unleashed on the world so that we do more together. And one of our newest projects is actually with a community organization in LA working on tree plantings. And we're trying to address what are the community barriers to doing more urban trees and urban greening projects, because it turns out we don't have those answers just in academia. It actually involves going out to the community and talking with them. So thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I'm looking at my friend Jill Summ and the Environmental Studies program, which really emphasizes community science and community engaged science, citizen science. We had a great talk by by Miguel Ordenada, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, from the museum next door, the Natural History Museum, and all of his work on tracking, wildlife, urban wildlife, and involving the community in doing that. I think that's all absolutely crucial to your point. And then the only thing that I would add to the smart, very spot on comments from my co-panelists is, in addition to asking people what their questions are and what they would like to know, also asking them what they would like to achieve. And then the next question is, and then how would you know if you got it? Like, what are the metrics you're looking for to know that you achieved what you want to achieve, so that when we start actually collecting data, we're collecting it using terminology and metrics that actually align with what people want, instead of saying, well, you want economic security, well, we'll deliver GDP to you. Well, I don't know what that. I don't know what that is still to this day. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do that really closes that gap in a way that we need to do.
Thanks. Please.
Hi. So the Yale program on climate change communication, in their study of the American mind on climate change, they just reported that 2/3 of Americans are for the government acting on climate change when asked about it, but less than 1/3 have heard anything about climate change in the last year. And then I think about George Marshall's book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. And a lot of what you guys have spoken to what's in his book. But one of the things he brings up is that scientists have been warning about the effects of climate change since the 1890s. Mm-hmm. That was when the first research was published on this issue. And so when you think about those two things, like we've been talking about this since the 1890s, less than 1/3 of Americans have heard about this issue in the last year. As behavioral scientists, how do you get everyone in this room to rally around in a way that actually affects what the general population is thinking and feeling about this issue, so that they actually hear about it?
Well, I have to go back to my original comment about the polarization and the politicization of climate change and climate communication. So if you look at where people mostly get their news and information, it's right-wing talk radio, it's Fox News, it's Facebook, it's YouTube. Those are the main sources. It's not, Scientific America. It's not, NPR. So, I mean, it's really a proportionality issue. We are outmatched, outspent, and outcommunicated, and that's part of the problem.
But people also receive information from their friends and family, and that is us. And so if I heard your citing the statistics correctly, you said 2/3 of people are concerned, 2/3 of Americans are concerned about climate change when asked about it, but 1/3 haven't heard about it. So that, right?
Only 1/3 have heard about it.
Only 1/3 have heard about it, right? So if we make climate change even more in the forefront of their minds, even more people might be concerned. And so we may not be able to influence what the media is focusing on, but we can influence the conversations that we have with people around us. And so we can talk about climate change and how it's visible around us and how it's affecting us and what we can do about it.
Yeah, all I would add is, live out loud. Like if you're doing things that are kind of pro-climate, live out loud. Show people that you're doing it. And if you have even a modicum of authority in your roles to influence how your colleagues or your subordinates might live their lives, then make it easier for them to act in a way that is in line with climate goals.
And I would add, if any of the students or faculty in the room communicate directly to the public about your work. We have one science communicator in the room. Yay! We can't put it all on you. So we need to communicate directly, to the public about our work. And there's all sorts of ways to do this. I've published a few articles in The Conversation, if you've heard about that. It's an online newspaper for academics to write about academic issues for the general public, and had over 400,000 reads of that, and that's way more than my citations in my APA journals, I can tell you that. So there are outlets, op-eds, and there's all sorts of ways to get information about your research that's so much relevant research we've heard about today going on, and I'm sure you're all engaged in it. Don't just put it behind paywalls of academic journals. Put it out there for the general public.
I might just jump in, but my favorite climate science communication specialist, and I'm sure a lot of people's, Katharine Hayhoe, her number one advice is always, when asked, what can you do about climate change? It's talk about it, right? It's very simple, but all of you can talk about it. If something is important to you, you often talk about it. So whether, that important thing to you is having better bike lanes and more safety for biking around LA or whatever it is, if something matters to you, you're often going to discuss it. So I would just say that applies for all of your research, that applies for you as individuals taking action, and it applies for probably everything else in life. Please, next question.
I think behavior is critical to everything we've talked about today. There is one thing we haven't talked about, though, is last year we hit 8 billion people on the planet, and by 2050 it'll be 9.7 billion. And I think that the most destructive thing to climate change or climate crisis is overpopulation. Just because it does connect to behavior, risk, education. What were your thoughts about that? Because I just haven't heard it brought up today about overpopulation.
Do any of you want to respond? I'm also happy to.
It's a third rail amongst scientists. I mean, we don't like talking about that because what then are we suggesting? Are we suggesting that we depopulate the Earth? So I mean, none of us really want to get into that question. That's why you don't hear it at meetings like this. Is the human population growing to a point of it being unsustainable? Probably. What are we going to do about it? Nothing. And why? Because of human rights, because of equity, because of the need to care for our fellow people. So, to me, it's one of those questions where the only answer is, yes, it's a problem. And like a lot of problems that are difficult to deal with, where there are going to be winners and losers, we just have to press on. Because what's the alternative? So to me, that's really what it comes down to. And I think and I come to that answer from a position of empathy and reality. We're not going to eliminate people from the planet on purpose.
I would also say that the issue with population is tied directly to consumption. And so where is population growth? Is it in the countries that are mega consumers that are producing a lot of the emissions? No. It is in developing economies where their emissions are much more negligible. We could handle a growing population if we all had a much more circular economy, if we consumed less, if the embedded carbon in all of our goods and our lifestyles was lower, we could handle it. But we don't have that right now. So it's also a matter of sustainability and understanding how is population tied to how are we using the finite limited resources on this planet, and can we use them more efficiently and effectively?
And then I would tie that back to Mick's question. We're not nudging a circular economy. That's going to require monstrous investments in infrastructure and massive changes to systems. That's going to require a lot of people to get busy really fast.
And if you want to look at numbers, it's not just population, it's the massive wealth disparities, right? So it's really high income people who are causing the majority of our climate problems. So it's really not just the numbers of people, it's what's happening with wealth disparity and what high income people are doing.
And what's really sad there is it's the highest income people that actually have a lot of capability to make really big changes. So, Wendy's got her bike helmet, which I applaud. I have 19 solar panels on the roof and an EV. Why? Because I can afford to do that. And if you can too, then do it.
Last question.
Thank you. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'll just kind of ask the question regarding kind of how to make people feel good about taking actions around like climate change. Because I think we talk a lot about like all of these dreary issues and like kind of put a lot of stress on the public, and it leads to a lot of climate anxiety, at least for like my generation that I've seen. And I just want to bring up an example. I've worked with the American Cancer Society for a long time, and some of the words that you brought up that are like no-no words, like fight, is something that they use in their mission statement and kind of thrive on, which is like this idea of like oh, like this is something personal that affects you, and let's take action about it. And so that's why I was really interested in an alternative to using the word that also empowers people, because they also use the word hope, and that helps a lot. But I think just kind of like, because climate change is something that people don't see as personal yet, like how can we make it personal and how can we make people feel empowered, I guess.
Gail to start.
Well, I just wanted to mention Susan Clayton's work. She's a psychologist who works on the issue of climate anxiety, and what her research shows is taking action. You don't necessarily have to be an activist. That's great if you want to be a climate activist, but just taking actions really reduces climate anxiety. So we talked all day about types of actions you can take, individual actions, collective actions, join a group, vote. There are many things you can do that are actions, and those will help to reduce climate anxiety according to the research.
Right. Messages of hope and empowerment are important to reduce climate anxiety. I completely agree with Gail.
And praising people, like giving people positive feedback for doing the right thing. So even if it's a member of your community, if it's a neighbor, if it's a stranger, praising people for doing the right thing, that kind of reward is really great. And then to your point about cancer, I agree with you. We can fight cancer because we all know it's bad and none of us want it. Climate change, I think, is different. So we still need to know our audiences and where those pressure points are going to be. But when we pick our language, so I didn't mean to imply that we shouldn't fight anything. There are plenty of things we should fight. I just don't think climate change is one of them yet.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our panelists for the excellent discussion today.
Thank you.